Hello everyone, and welcome to our webinar, Race to the Digital Future, How Procurement and IT Can Win Together, presented by GEP with participation from Forrester Research. My name is Edie Sachs from GEP. We're looking forward to a lively presentation on the prospects and the rewards of closer collaboration between IT and procurement, particularly concerning the advancement of digital transformation for procurement and throughout the larger enterprise. I'd now like to introduce our speakers for today's webinar. We're joined by Duncan Jones, Vice President and Principal Analyst at Forrester Research, and Paul Blake, Associate Director of Technology Product Marketing at GEP. Between the two of them, they have several decades worth of experience tracking the trends and developments that have impacted best practices in business application, sourcing, and procurement strategies. So without further ado, let's get this webinar started. We'll lead off with GEP's Paul Blake. Off to you, Paul.
Thank you, Edie. And good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. Welcome to the webinar. And thanks from me personally to Duncan for joining this session. I'm really looking forward to hearing what Duncan has to say. I've had a sneak preview of his slides, and I think it's going to be a very interesting topic. I just want to kick off and do a little bit of introduction before we get to the real important part of this webinar, which is Duncan's presentation. Last week I was at a conference and I ended up having dinner with the CPO of, let's say, a globally renowned university here in the northeast of the United States. A very significant institution indeed. And this CPO was telling me that the challenge that they had in driving new types of value, getting more savings, getting more effectiveness in procurement across the institution was the size and strength of the IT function there, traditionally. Today, they've achieved a huge amount of progress by working more closely with IT within the university, but because so much of the capital expenditure, so much of the research, so much of the faculty was dependent upon IT, IT had an enormous influence and an enormous amount of power and control over how everything worked. And that, they found, was hampering procurement's ability to act and procurement's ability to be really effective. And through connecting with and collaborating with the IT leadership, getting a mutual understanding of what the drivers were, procurement was able to be so much more effective. And it was a very timely conversation to have, and it was great to hear that the things that we believe to be most important about the relationship between procurement and IT have been put into practice and delivering great results. We all know that technology drives procurement success, right? It drives success, it drives productivity. But there is some evidence that that is not a simple picture. It is not a simple equation that if you throw technology at a problem, you're going to get greater output. This is demonstrated in some data, and I really like this particular chart, so I've done a little bit of an update on it and made it a bit more 3D, just for my own amusement. But this is a plot of output from the British economy. It's reflected in other Western economies. This is data from the Office of National Statistics in the UK. And over the last many decades, actually, they've been tracking output from the economy. But over the last 20 years, we start to see a nice gradual upturn in output and productivity, which if you plot as a best fit line would suggest that around now we should be being 40 to 50% more productive than we were 20 years ago, and certainly more productive than we were a decade ago. However, the data shows a different pattern entirely. Not only was there a downturn around 10 years ago with a certain dip in the global economy, but in fact productivity and output has really flatlined since then. And there are a lot of varied and complex reasons as to why this might be so, but I would maintain that one of the major contributing factors to this, particularly in the kind of environments that we're talking about and discussing today, is that the technology that we're using has fundamentally reached a limit on how productive we can be with it. And in fact, there is a report that Microsoft published back at the beginning of this year which warns of technology distractions, saying that technology can distract workers rather than making them more productive. And this is a message that's coming from Microsoft, and I find that really intriguing. Commentating on this particular report, Sir Kerry Cooper from the Manchester Business School said technology can overload people and make them less productive because they get caught up in it rather than use it to deliver a service or a product. Productivity comes from creative interchange. It does not come from people sitting in front of machines sending emails. And I think that is a really key point. We spend so much of our time in any job, if we are office-based or information technology-based, sending emails, dealing with the three pillars of our technology structure, which are emails, messages, standalone documents, and standalone disconnected applications. And that particular way of working has installed a fundamental limit on how much we can get done doing the same kind of jobs, doing the same sort of processes that we have traditionally been doing. And so much of our day is spent working with technology that doesn't allow us to increase the cadence in procurement, doesn't allow us to increase the frequency of sourcing, doesn't allow us to drive any more value out of what we're doing, that I think that has played a major part in limiting that growth, limiting the output that is possible within the modern workplace, particularly within procurement. So when we look to see how the balance of power in an organization between IT and procurement is formulated, we have to bear in mind the impact that a wrong balance will have on the ability that we have to break out of that productivity trap. What we need, of course, is a nice 2x2 grid. What I'll do here is I will plot the influence of IT against the influence of procurement. And of course, there are 4 different possible scenarios that we have here. When IT is overwhelmingly strong and overwhelmingly powerful, we do run the risk of having a future state in procurement that is dominated by the wrong technology. This is what I call the ERP-centric model of procurement in the future. Software that is designed perfectly well, but for different purposes that procurement end up having to deal with, end up having to work with and work around, because that is what IT have said is the way forward. Conversely, if procurement or indeed any other business area is able to dictate to IT what goes on, we end up with chaos. You know, with a lack of vision of the future, with no particular long-term goal towards a digitally transformed platform for the entire organization, we end up with disparate applications, different point solutions that have been put in place for, forgive me, a more narrow-minded view that individual business leaders may have within their own area of focus. So we end up with a kind of adhocracy of information technology within the organization. But if neither is pushing an agenda, we end up with stagnation. We end up with an office model that is no further forward than it was in the 1980s. There's no progress. The systems and processes get locked into that old model of email, document, and application, because somebody has to force an agenda. Somebody has to force evolution and revolution in order to deliver different types of value. And if IT and procurement don't push their agenda, either of them, perhaps because there is no political will to move anything forward, that's what we end up with. So the synergy that results from both a strong procurement organization and a strong IT organization working together is where the future has to be. The shared agenda and the shared vision is the way forward to the digital workplace of the future. So it has to be that, as the CPO of the university said, you have to get together with the IT people. The procurement and IT people need to get together, share their vision, understand where the commonalities are, understand where the tensions are, if we're going to then drive to get significant new value out of procurement and out of this digital workplace of the future. So the digital workplace for procurement, as we see it, is a unified workplace that allows all of the stakeholders, not just the procurement team and not just the end user buyers, but also the executives in the C-suite, the people in finance and administration, and the suppliers themselves, to participate in a single seamless set of applications and functions, whether that is simply in the order processing P2P end of things, or whether it is in the more strategic planning, innovation, and sourcing side of things. There needs to be a single unified workplace. And that is going to provide a whole series of different front-end experiences for the different parties, unification of workflow, robotic automation of mundane processes, and that is founded on emerging technologies and big data and data lakes and data science and artificial intelligence and all of these things which are coming along. And therefore it is critical that IT play a role in the definition of what procurement is going to be doing in the future. But IT cannot be the sole voice. It has to be that procurement stakeholders have a voice that is heard in that process, in that planning program, to put together this unified workplace. What we don't want to do, of course, is end up with the irresistible force meeting the unmovable object. And I couldn't resist the opportunity to include a panel from a Marvel comic on the day after the great Stan Lee passed away. But this was a great way to illustrate that, in fact, you don't have to have conflict where you've got an irresistible force of procurement wanting to drive into the future and the unmovable object, supposedly, of IT's intransigence and being the department who likes to say no. We do run the risk of organizational stalemate if there is no agreement and no communication. It doesn't have to be a disaster, though. As Ogden Nash said, marriage is the only example of the happy meeting of the immovable object and the irresistible force. So I think it's clear that IT and procurement need to work together, need to collaborate, need to understand each other's drivers, and also to share a vision, because fundamentally procurement can be IT's biggest champion in driving forward the digital workplace that the IT leaders want to see put into place. But leave procurement aside and all of that work can be for nothing. So at this point, I'd like to hand over to Duncan, and I think he's got some great stories to tell us, some great ideas to unpack as we move forward to see precisely how procurement and IT can work together for that race for the digital future. Duncan, over to you.
Thank you, Paul. And hopefully I'm going to build on that context that you set here to talk about how this is playing out in the field of technology, particularly related to procurement and direct procurement. So I'm going to talk about how the needs of organizations' customers are driving new priorities for procurement beyond its traditional goals of cost savings. How modern, flexible, smart software is vital for enabling procurement to achieve those priorities. And then I'm going to finish with some summary recommendations. Now, the context for my research into procurement technology is Forrester's overall theme of customer-obsessed companies. We see increasingly that the businesses that are being most successful in highly competitive marketplaces are those that are embodying four principles that we call customer-obsessed operating principles. I won't go into lots of detail about these four. They're fairly self-evident, and you can read more about them if you are a Forrester client and want to read about the customer-obsessed operating model. But I'd like to explain how these principles of customer-led, insights-driven, fast, and connected apply to procurement and indeed to finance and other related groups, just as much as they apply to the rest of the organization. So being customer-led means that procurement, in my view, should give a greater priority to the bits of its job that really matter most to the organization's customers. And when I say customers, I mean the real customers, the organization's customers, not our colleagues who procurement sometimes mistakenly calls customers. When I talk about insight-driven, we need to use artificial intelligence, analytics, data, and so on to drive better decision-making. We also need to operate much quicker. We need to enable our colleagues to work much faster, whether it's buying the goods and services they need or onboarding new suppliers that are going to deliver innovation into our product. We need to be much more agile and get out of their way to a certain extent. And on being connected, we need to work more closely with other related groups, such as product development, engineering, and so on. But we also need to be connected with each other, with our peers in communities of buyers that can share information and insights and algorithms. So let's look at a little bit more why those principles are so important. Well, the first bit of data I'm going to share with you is from a survey of managers in business who are involved in purchasing decisions, not just in IT or procurement, but in other operational roles as well. And we asked them, in what you're doing, what are your organization's wider priorities, not just your department, but the wider organization? And of course, you can see that there are lots of different priorities, all getting scores of 50% or more. Lots of different things to worry about. And what I'd like to urge you to consider is that procurement should be involved in all of these. We can't sit back on the outside and say, well, we'll take care of this number 3, reducing costs, and let everybody else focus on innovation and customer experience. Now, we have to be driving improvements in customer experience and in innovation as well. So I would argue that these priorities here are increasingly important for procurement over and above costs. Not that we can ignore costs, but we just need to stop talking about it. Nobody else really cares about cost savings the way we care about it. The way procurement measures savings doesn't make sense to anyone else anyway. So we're not going to get a lot of buy-in from our colleagues if that's all we focus on. But if we can talk about how procurement enables better innovation, how procurement is really driving the move to digital business, and at the same time increasing the compliance with regulations and other risk-related concerns, then I think that's when procurement becomes viewed more strategically and gets more credibility. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about each of these. And it's really in this context that, in 10 years ago, when I first started studying procurement technology, the whole focus was about cost. Everybody was talking about reverse auctions to squeeze margins, online events to increase competition, aggregating spend with fewer vendors. Everything was cost-focused. Maybe over the last few years, procurement professionals have started to talk a little bit more about value. Now, the most advanced ones will be moving beyond that and looking at the customer-focused procurement. What does procurement do that matters to customers? So I put this in a timeline of what the focus is of the industry, but I think it's also a maturity curve. Still, many of the clients that I speak with, many of the procurement professionals that I speak with at conferences, might claim that they're value-focused, but really cost is number one, and that's got to change. Because customers don't care about cost savings like they care about risk, about co-innovation with suppliers, enabling colleagues to buy what they need quickly and easily. So risk is really important, and this is something that procurement actually already does in an organization, but maybe doesn't publicize as well as it could do. And it's an example of what procurement does that really matters to the organization's customers. Very often when people are talking about risk, they're focused on one type of risk, maybe financial viability or cybersecurity. I'd like to argue that there are multiple types of supplier-related risk that you need to be thinking about and managing, not because regulators tell you to do it, but because the organization's customers want you to do it. We want you to pick suppliers that are safe, that are reliable. I have an example here of British Airways that lost 4% of its stock value overnight when a supplier caused the vital check-in system to fail. We need security, but we also need safety. Many of you may have been affected in the UK by an example recently where an innovative train was being trialed out coming into London and managed to bring down the power lines and close the station. We need that safety and security to be taken care of. And on ethics, this is increasingly important to customers. They're choosing the brands that they buy from on the basis of things like sustainability and fair labor practices. And there were even examples of companies like Adidas here making products out of recycled plastic, trying to get a competitive advantage by being more sustainable than its peers. So here's an example where procurement can really drive competitive advantage by driving a more ethical supply chain as well as being safe and secure. Another area is in innovation. Increasingly, innovation is coming from the supply base. I've got an example here of the automotive industry. If you look at car ads these days on the TV, there's much more about the driver assistance technology in the vehicle, safety systems, audio, convenience, safe driving, all that sort of thing. And that's not coming from car manufacturers specifying it in detail and then putting it out for lowest bidder. It's coming from their ecosystem of suppliers working together to pool data, to work with technology providers to turn that data into insight or useful software that is going to differentiate the car manufacturer. And indeed, the car manufacturers are almost competing with each other to be the preferred customer for the best innovation coming from the digital ecosystem. And what happens if you're too risk averse? If you look at the previous slide and say, well, we need to guard against all these dangers of unsafe products, unreliable suppliers, then you can be like the security guard here, just saying, no, you can't come in. And that can have two impacts. That can either stifle innovation because you're not allowed to work with new suppliers who have some great ideas, or you become just so difficult to work with that the best suppliers say, no, I'm not going to work with you, I'm not going to fill out your 500-page onboarding questionnaire. Life's too short. So that's one downside. The even worse could be that colleagues just ignore your processes because they need to move faster than you're allowing them to do, and they let the suppliers in through the back door, and there's all sorts of risks about unsecured data, and you don't know who's let loose in the organization. So too much risk aversion and too much process can actually lead to increased risk rather than lower risk. So now let's move on to how modern flexible smart software is vital for balancing these conflicting demands of innovation and risk protection. Now, the first point to make is building on what Paul said earlier. The ERP era is over. For years, we were promised omniscience if we could only get everyone in the business using a common set of software. And I've heard this message for 20 years. And it never proved to deliver on this promise of omniscience. And what we increasingly see in enterprises is kind of this fragmentation of various systems. Because the ERP systems failed, there are hundreds or thousands of point solutions, spreadsheets, customizations, mobile apps, add-on tools, which are in fact inhibiting our visibility because the data isn't real time and it isn't integrated one system with another. So the reality of most enterprises' lives is very different from that picture on the left, which was what they were promised. Indeed, my hypothesis is that Omnisuites, as I call them, the suites that try to do everything for everybody in an enterprise across every division and every function, will never work. Over and again, we've been promised this omniscience. We were told to put in one ERP system everywhere, and then we were told, well, we had to consolidate instances, and then it was, oh, you need to put a data warehouse on top, and then a data lake, and now you see some companies promising the next iteration of this, which is something called a digital core or something like that. They're all really false promises of omniscience from a single source. The reality is that businesses vary too widely for one suite to do everything for everybody in the business. And as soon as you rely on proprietary technologies, you find that you're losing pace with the market, that they fail to evolve, technology innovation leaves them behind, and you're left with a legacy millstone around your neck. We also see that the data is inconsistent across the business unit. So even if you do manage to put in the same ERP product everywhere, you'll find that you can't just add up the data and get omniscience because people use different data structures, or they code things differently, and they use different codes for things. So you can't just add up the data and get insight. The other point, and increasingly important now, is even if we could get all this history in one place and use the data consistently, it still won't be much use because it's already out of date as soon as we've done that. That now the decisions that we're having to make in business needing real-time data now. What's the weather now? What's the traffic conditions now? What's customer demand right now? So what's the future like? If ERP and its iterations aren't the answer, what replaces it? Is it going to be that nightmare of a million stars that I showed earlier? Well, no, not really. As the ERP false promise explodes in a big bang, what we're seeing is a gravity pulling together different processes that are related with each other into a set of galaxies, if you like, SaaS platforms that handle a group of processes: financials, procurement, human capital management, operations, customer relationship management, and so on. So the replacement of ERP is not thousands of point solutions or a million microservices that you have to stitch together yourself. It's a few platforms, maybe 5, 6, 10 across the enterprise, that do a bunch of processes in an integrated way internally, but that can also speak with each other. If you buy into this vision, you may then want to know, well, how do I choose a good platform? What do I look for in a platform to say this is going to be part of my application landscape in the future? Well, there are really 5 key qualities that you want to look for in a good application platform. I'm going to talk about some of these in a little bit more detail with some examples. Firstly, embedded artificial intelligence. A lot of people are trying to put a Band-Aid over the deficiencies of ERP by implementing separate RPA tools to kind of speed up processes a little bit. That can take you only so far. Because you're going to have to do all the work to get the data and build up the rules. really the best use of AI is going to come from the platform vendors themselves and their ecosystem of implementation partners, analyzing data in the platform, coming up with great insights, turning those into algorithms that you can implement within your own business. Now, usability, of course, is always a key selection criteria, but the standard for usability is going to be increasingly different. It's not going to be nice graphical design on a PC. It's going to be much more about an intuitive UI that knows what you want to do before you tell the system. In particular, natural language processing is going to be an increasingly important driver. So I'm going to say to the software, tell me my purchase order status, and it's going to know what I'm looking for. I don't have to remember which menu I have to go down to find the purchase order report. We're going to see low-code extensibility. To put that in a non-IT frame, it's going to mean that the software is easily modifiable, not just by IT people, but by users with a little bit of training to add fields into a screen, to maybe alter workflows, to remove superfluous approval steps, take them out of a workflow and replace them with automated validation, for example. Integration, of course, is going to be vital. These platforms are going to have to talk not only with each other, but an ecosystem of add-on tools that are going to extend them. And lastly, they're mostly going to be SaaS, because SaaS gives you the flexibility, continual enhancement of the product. We can't live with these huge upgrades from version 3 to version 4, over version 10 to a version 11. But not only that, they're going to be the basis for an ecosystem. So the innovation that you get when you buy a platform is not just what the vendor produces, it's an ecosystem of add-on tools, small vendors, system implementators and the like. So think of the platform as the center of the galaxy with a galaxy of stars orbiting around it. So I talked about the importance of AI as maybe the most important criteria to look for when choosing a platform. A lot of people are afraid that AI will replace people and eliminate jobs. And it will to a certain extent, but on the whole, we see it as more empowering. AI is going to allow you to do more by giving you access to more data, more information, so you can make better decisions. It's going to liberate you by taking away some of the boring, repetitive tasks, automating those, leaving you with more time to do more interesting and more valuable work. And it's also going to amplify your intelligence and insight. If you analyze some data and you find some insight about some problem, and you decide how to correct that problem, then with artificial intelligence, you can replicate that correction to every other situation that matches it, and say, next time that happens, do this fix automatically. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about some of these. Let's first of all look at an example of automating the mundane tasks. Now, very often, when I talk to clients about automating procurement, I find that they have a very long and time-consuming approval process for simple transactions. And rules-based purchase approval can streamline that. If we put a robot in this process, we can actually drive the requisition directly through into a purchase order that we send out to the supplier, bypassing all the steps in the middle, because we identify what rules the human beings are applying when they look at a requisition to decide whether to approve it or not. And we turn those into automated validations. So assuming that the transaction passes those automated validations, it goes straight out the door much more quickly. And if something fails the rules, then we can point the exception to the human being. And that way we get better control, because the human being is, instead of rubber stamping these transactions that are fine, they're going to get a few exceptions that really warrant their attention, so they can spend more time actually thinking about those exceptions and deciding whether to approve them. The next example is the one about amplifying the human being's power. So I talk about smart applications turning work from a drill-down approach into alert up. Now, what I mean by that is, in the ERP sort of Omniscience model, the data lake model, you get a lot of history, and then you get some analysts pouring through the data, playing with the Rubik's Cube to look at the data in various ways. The CPO or the CFO starts at the top with some anomaly or variance, and they double-click on it, and they double-click again, and they double-click again, and eventually they drill down to the transactions which caused the anomaly in the high-level number. But of course, by then it's too late to do much about it. But if we can identify why that transaction was an anomaly, we can program into the software a smart alert, like this guy with a flag here, to say, okay, next time that happens, tell me immediately, or better still, tell somebody who works for me immediately, so they can actually do something about it. Either check it before it happens, or mitigate the risk of the bad thing. And this is going to be a combination of formal rules of if then else, but also machine learning what people, learning the why we flag certain transactions as anomalies, and therefore what we need to do to prevent them happening in future. So we could imagine, if the system identifies which types of transactions are fraudulent or wasteful, then it can point those out immediately, so they get extra approval by a manager, rather than having to rely on some sort of post hoc audit when it's too late to do much about it. The last example of use of AI I want to talk about is in the supplier ecosystem collaboration. This is an example from the aerospace industry, where many companies that supply parts to aircraft manufacturers are actually getting together to share the data that their parts are collecting while the aircraft is in flight. And by working together, they can analyze that data and feed back to the aircraft manufacturer information about how the aircraft is performing, to give them advice about proactive maintenance, or maybe fuel efficiency, or other things that will be of value to the manufacturer's client, the airline. That's not driven from the top down. This is the suppliers getting together to pool data and analyze it. And that requires a lot of collaboration, but it requires the procurement function to really drive that collaboration, to encourage it, to facilitate it, to reward the suppliers that are participating in the ecosystem and pooling data and sharing appropriately, and to penalize the ones that are trying to keep the data all to themselves. So let's finish then with some summary recommendations. Firstly, set new priorities for the procurement function, and of course the KPIs to measure them, that align better with what customers want. Let's talk much more about our role in driving innovation within our ecosystem, with protecting customers from risk, with speeding up and digitizing processes. And let's talk less about cost savings, which nobody else cares about. In order to prepare for this future of procurement, which is far more customer-focused, we need to implement modern smart software. So really start driving the business case for implementing this software. You're going to need it in the future. You can't do your job properly without it. When you're looking at the software, look for specialist SaaS platforms. Avoid this failed Omnisuite model. Don't let any colleagues persuade you that you can get Omniscience from a single proprietary platform. It doesn't work. The specialist SaaS platforms should be demonstrating domain-specific uses of AI, not just raw tools that you have to train yourself, but actually data and algorithms already built into the product that give you suggestions about how you can work better. And they've also got to be open, easy to integrate with other tools, to integrate with suppliers, systems, extensible so that you can develop your own processes beyond what the platform provides, so that you can plug in from the ecosystem of add-on tools. And of course, they've got to be easy to use, intuitive, the AI driving the software, so we don't have to enter data unless we really have to. And the last point I would make is rethink all of your procurement processes. Try to build in this concept of alert up, replacing drill down, and try and get away from look at it from the old way of working. Look at every manual step in the process and say, how can we automate that? Maybe not 100%, but at least 90% by rules and machine learning, to eliminate the waste and delay in the process. Let's not perpetuate the paper-driven model. Let's really ruthlessly drive greater efficiency and streamlining throughout everything we do. Well, I hope that set out a compelling vision for the future of procurement. And now I'll hand that back to Paul.
Great, Duncan, thank you very much. Just before I move on to my next thought, I'm just going to jump back to one of your earlier slides, which spells out the key qualities of this digital workplace of the future as Duncan sees them. You know, you've heard the analyst's perspective on this. I want to give you the software developer's perspective on this. I think it's 100% right. It's exactly right, and I really love this slide because it's all of the things that we think are critical about how we are developing our software and what we think is going to be important in the future. Of course, AI is going to play a major role, not only in the automation side of things that we've talked about already, but actually in the analysis, discovery, the translation of data from its raw state into actionable intelligence. So much of that is going to be driven by AI. But AI also will have a critical role to play in making that ecosystem that Duncan referred to actually work. The reason that this Omnisuite idea got so much traction is because it's very hard to see how, with a completely disconnected set of different technologies and different data, you can get to some kind of common framework and some kind of view of the truth. But that's what this digital workplace model is all about. It's not about one single product to do everything from HR and CRM through procurement and supply chain and expenses and manufacturing and all of those other processes in one platform. That's unlikely to ever work. What that ecosystem is all about is using the various sub-suites, if you like, and making them connect to each other in a way that is actually meaningful. And AI is going to play a huge role in that. And of course, the cloud is going to be the platform on which that happens, because it can't realistically happen anywhere else. And the huge advantage that we get as software developers from using the cloud, such as Microsoft Azure, is that it disconnects us from having to build that infrastructure. It allows us to just focus on the really smart stuff, the AI, the interconnectivity, the integration between functions across the business, without having to spend a huge amount of effort building the infrastructural and lower level layers of the stack that the cloud can provide us so readily. And that extensibility of functionality, the ability for the customer to decide how they want the software to work for them. Somebody once described ERP to me as being like concrete. It's fantastic while you're still pouring it, whilst it's still wet, but once you've shaped it and molded it to how it's going to be and let it go off, you're stuck with that for decades. And the future of this digital workplace is that extensibility for it to shift with you as your priorities change. And all of that's going to happen through a much more conversational, much more intelligent interface that is driven by the kind of innovations that we're seeing. So I just wanted to jump back to that slide because these really are the key areas that we see as being important going forward. I'm just going to wrap up with a couple of thoughts then. Here's some more data from this year. The CPO's top objectives. It's reflecting Duncan's slide from earlier that we saw of the various priorities that people are placing on things. And from this particular piece of research, I was really surprised to see advanced analytics as the top priority for CPOs. Not that it shouldn't be important, and as Duncan said, procurement needs to think about all of these other impacts, all of these other areas, not just savings. But the top priority for the CPO is analytics? Really? Surely that can't be right, but it is. Why? Because the CPOs haven't got the insights and intelligence that they need to drive the transformation in value that they're seeking. The CPO and their team should be focusing on savings and value delivery and improved efficiency and reduced risk and all of those other things because of the onward impact they have on customer value. But the focus, the attention is now on technology. New and better technology is in third place here, and advanced analytics, because the tech that is extant within the organizations isn't working to deliver that, and the focus is moving away from core procurement activity to technology because the IT team and the procurement team are not really effectively working together. But what the IT team can bring to the party is manifold. Let's start by looking at this idea of intelligence. The purpose of advanced analytics should be, as I said earlier, about gaining actionable intelligence. So the IT team can bring intelligence to procurement by making the data accessible, understandable through the application of the right kind of technologies, with a view not just to providing a data lake with some AI to do that analysis at source. But also the IT team can force the agenda, both for themselves and for procurement, by understanding what the goal is and getting together with procurement to agree on that agenda. And that is what's going to lead to transformation. That's going to lead to this step change in value delivery, the quantum jump in savings and operational efficiency that procurement can deliver. And that's only achievable through collaboration, not just between IT and procurement, but by ensuring that the end users downstream who have to raise the purchase orders, the people in AP, the suppliers themselves, are able to effectively communicate and collaborate through this digital workplace. And it has to be founded on the basis of security and risk management. As Duncan said earlier, the IT people are critical because there's more data and more into this digital workplace. There has to be that oversight. That has to be that important role that IT have traditionally played and that shouldn't go away in making sure that the data and the processes are secure. And together these all add up to a vision of the future. And why have I laid it out like this? Well, it's really just a shameless plug for a set of white papers that we have produced in a range called Insight IT. These are white papers that we have written specifically for the IT community to unpack some of these ideas and to spell out why it's important for procurement and why their stakeholders and customers and colleagues in procurement should always be at the forefront of their minds when they're thinking about digital transformation. So for the procurement folks in this webinar, I would encourage you to urge your colleagues in IT to get hold of these papers and indeed other pieces of thought leadership on the subject of why procurement is important in a digitally transformed future, because it is important that you can get the IT people on side and collaborating with you. So at that point, I think it would be great to open up some questions if we have some. So Edie, back to you to field what we have coming in.
Okay, Paul, before I toss you a question, I just do want to mention that the Inside IT series that you just showed to the audience is available in the GEP Knowledge Bank, and we did provide a link to that knowledge bank on the resource list, which you should be able to see on your webinar console. But here is an interesting question. You have argued against, and by you I presume that the questioner refers to both you and Duncan, you have argued against ERP systems and in favor of function-specific business applications. Are we going to end up with too many apps and therefore with functional redundancies?
I think there is always that concern, isn't there? So I think managing an application strategy it can prevent too much proliferation. If you base your strategy on these SaaS platforms, these sort of galaxies that I talked about, then you have some critical mass, and those platforms attract an ecosystem of add-on products that are then integrated out of the box. So you don't have to do that work yourself. So you need to follow a sort of an eclectic strategy with different tools for different jobs. But that doesn't mean to say it's sort of anarchy. You still have to have a strategy of picking a few platforms and standardizing on those platforms and their ecosystems. The other point I'd make is, the ERP model, in fact, resulted in application proliferation because it has so many weak spots in it that we have thousands and thousands of add-on applications. They're just called spreadsheets or manual processes or customizations, or if you look at any ERP implementation, actually there's thousands of bits of custom code that have been written trying to make it work. So it's not like you got the one solution that you were promised anyway. So I think that's why the best organizations are moving the needle a little bit to platforms, but with governance and strategy to prevent it becoming anarchy. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, I think
it's obviously a long discussion that we could have on that topic.
Yeah, I think it does answer the question, Duncan, because I think it's exactly right. I mean, it really is interesting that the reflection of the diktat that there will be a single system is in the procurement's experience of there will be one compliant process, there will be one way for you to purchase things, and whenever you try and impose that kind of monolithic approach, particularly in the modern workplace, you end up with a proliferation of chaos by stealth almost. If you insist that there is only one application to be used, you will end up with that proliferation whether you want it or not. So it's much better to have a curated approach to get the right solutions in the right place and to build that ecosystem in a meaningful way than actually let it happen by the back door. And the way to do that, I think the way to do that, to manage it and to have the governance, is for that open dialogue between the business stakeholders and the IT department, and IT not being just a gatekeeper and a blocker and a dictator as to how things should be, but actually a facilitator and the people who can make all these things possible. Because ultimately, if they're not, then the IT department will be gradually moved out of the way in favor of a chaotic model, and that's not what any of us wants.
I think one point I'd make, Paul, is we at Forrester see the same trend happening in other areas beyond ERP, where somebody came up with some Omnisuite vision with E at the start and M at the end, like enterprise content management, or product lifecycle management or human capital management. Inevitably, those suites were let down by the various weak spots in them, and new point applications emerge to fill in the gaps. So there's always this evolution process going on. I think the vision for the way forward is that the platform, so ecosystem concept, embraces the fact that innovation is going to come from outside, that you're not going to develop everything yourself, that you're going to make it easy for innovators to do that and then sell it into your customer base.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's the interesting thing, is that if you look at, I think about ourselves and our approach to technology. Okay, we consider ourselves to be expert in building procurement software, source-to-pay software. We would not make any claims at all at being having anything to say about human resource management or product lifecycle management at this stage. But why should that preclude our customers from using the best of the best in both areas? What the cloud model and the AI model will allow to happen in the future is for those to become part of a seamless ecosystem with the appropriate data shared, the appropriate processes and workflows mapped between those different platforms without the need to resort to a single monolithic structure. And that gives greater flexibility not only in what the different areas of interest want to do specifically, within their boundaries, but also makes it easier for removes the cost of switching if there is a particular desire for one area to move into a different technology set without impacting the rest of the business, but also flexibility in how the different parts of the operation can grow at different speeds and do things in their own way, but still be part of the unified core that the organization has always wanted. And the AI cloud model is what's going to make that possible.
I think one example of where that plays out is something like new product introduction, which tends to be very specific to an industry, even to a particular company within an enterprise. So it's an area where something may be quite custom developed on one of these platforms, and it will, of course, integrate with the sourcing and procurement processes, and it will integrate with the design and engineering and demand planning processes. But to think that means that your design system and your procurement system should come from one vendor and be built on a common proprietary technology, that just doesn't make sense.
No, indeed. So, Edie, any other questions that you'd like to field us in the final minute that we have?
Yeah, if you can take maybe 2 minutes to answer a question that has come in about blockchain, and unsurprisingly, because it's such a hot topic nowadays, what role will blockchain play in the digital procurement environment? So, the Cliff Notes version, please.
Okay, the very brief answer is nobody has any idea. I believe that to be true, even though there are some very strong opinions in terms of predicting what the future is. I think it's very hard to say. I think the interesting thing for me is that I don't see blockchain as being anything that we need to worry about as individuals. It's an infrastructure layer technology as I see it, and it's something that may well underpin a lot of the digital workplace of the future, but it's not an application or a function or a feature that in procurement we need to worry about how we're going to take advantage of it in the next year to 5 years or whatever. It's something that's going to come along as a deeply embedded part of processes, in the same way that secure sockets and other forms of encryption and message transport and whatever are becoming relevant. Is it going to give us additional capabilities? Perhaps in the future. What those capabilities are, will it let us do more than we can currently do? Will let us do anything different than we're currently doing? I'm not convinced. Duncan may have a completely different opinion.
I would agree with Paul. I think generally I'm against coming at technologies that way around and saying, right, here's this technology, what can we do with it? I think I'd rather look at the problems that we need to fix and then use the tools in our toolbox to fix those problems. Like, we need to accelerate supplier onboarding and make it faster and more flexible. We can use a bit of RPA and a bit of machine learning and a bit of natural language processing. If blockchain helps that process, then great. But let's tackle the priority problems first. I think the one exception, though, having said that, is that where the IT group is looking for use cases to pilot some new technologies like RPA or machine learning, I think procurement should be raising its hand and volunteering to be the pilot use cases, because then we can get the investment to do the things that we need to do. We can help the organization learn about how to deploy these technologies in an area where it's relatively safe and there's a clear return. So let's volunteer to be the pilot. But I would say blockchain is at the back of the list. There are far more interesting technologies than that.
That makes a lot of sense, Duncan. But we have arrived at the 1 hour mark. We're a little bit past 1 hour, actually. So that is all the time we are going to have for today's webinar. So I want to thank all of our audience members for attending, and I want to give a huge thank you to Duncan and to Paul for facilitating today's discussion.